Welcome to City and State TV. I'm Managing Editor Michael Johnson, and joining me today is Bruce Gyory, a columnist, contributor to City and State. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
And your recent column, you talked about the Working Families Party's relationship with Governor Cuomo, how they shouldn't have a divorce yet, for lack of a better term, and you laid out 5 points. I wanted to go through those points one by one.
Sounds good.
The first point you made was the voter registration numbers. So can you just break those down for us a little bit?
Democrats lead Republicans by 3.1 million, and people focus on that, but it's 2.7 of that comes from New York City. Outside of New York City, where in recent elections 70% of the gubernatorial vote is cast, outside of New York City, the Democratic registration edge is only 400,000 votes, but there are 1.6 million unaffiliated, or as we call them, independent, or think of them, independent voters, even though under the election law they're unaffiliated, which means that New York is a Democratic state, not a liberal state. And you balance that with the polling data that shows that in New York, liberals and conservatives are equal. Now that makes us feel more liberal because nationally there are more conservatives than liberals, but really for Democrats to do well, they have to get the votes of moderate independents and conservative Democrats. And that's the trick for winning statewide elections. And by the way, the Working Families Party in the past has been very sensitive and accommodating to that, has not tried to get in the way. What they've tried to do is to use the Democrats' recent strength in that regard to leverage their policy agenda.
So what's happening with this scenario that's playing out? Do you think that the members of the Working Families Party, bolstered by the victory of Bill de Blasio, maybe are just listening to themselves too much and not aware of the upstate-downstate divide?
No, I think they know it. I think there's a two-part. I think there are mistakes on both sides. I think the governor has forgotten Bill Clinton's admonition that Democrats, and when Clinton said Democrats, he really meant liberals, Democrats need to fall in love while Republicans fall in line. And I think the liberal base of the Democratic Party and the working families, while not technically a part of that, is aligned with that, has not really felt the love from Cuomo. And one of the things you get with Governor Cuomo is, because he's such a outstanding legislative tactician, he tends to think of things in pragmatic terms. And if the votes are not there in the legislature at that moment, he tends to tell you that. Well, I think the liberals and the Working Families Party would like to hear a little bit of bully pulpit passion, even if he can't get the votes, and that reflects that. But the larger frustration, and I don't think, is that the Working Families Party is feeling roadblocks in the state Senate. And so I think the governor needs to show a little love, and I think the Working Families Party needs to focus on what its mission is. And in saying that, I'm not saying what Bruce Gyory thinks their mission should be. I'm trying to analyze what they have defined their mission by dint of what their activities have been.
Gotcha. Your second point you brought up was the...
So I'm marriage counseling, yes, without anybody
exactly.
asking me.
I'm sure they appreciate it, though.
I bet.
The second point you brought up was the ideology, and you compared them to the Conservative Party,
yes.
Basically making the point that the Conservative Party had the goal of making Republicans more conservative, where the Working Families Party has been more focused on passing legislation
Correct.
To help people.
I mean, the conventional wisdom is the Working Families Party is very ideological. And the Conservative Party is too. But in reality, the Conservative Party's mission, as you said, was to make it so that Republicans like Rockefeller and Lindsay and Javits could no longer get statewide nomination. They wanted to drive them out of contention for Republican nominations, and they have been marvelously successful in that. The Working Families Party has been ideological in a philosophical sense, but they have not attacked the wholesale end of the ideological market. They have tackled the retail end of the policy legislative market. So behind their agenda has been, we want to pass increases in minimum wage. We want to reform the Rockefeller drug laws. We want to pass same-sex marriage. We want paid and living living wages, paid sick leave, family leave, and now we want campaign finance. We want the DREAM Act. So they have used their leverage tied to turnout and their alliance with labor to turn out their voters to build to build strength behind those agendas. It's a different way of viewing it. So it's not so I repeat, it's not what I think they should do. They have put their priority by past action on that retail legislative market. And I repeat, their frustration is the state Senate majority coalition is not passing those bills at this point.
And that gets to kind of your third point a little
Yeah.
bit when you're talking about Andrew Cuomo's power. Does he have the power to get this legislation done? And, I think some would argue that he's gotten a lot of progressive stuff done. So is the
Right.
Working Families Party, greedy? Do they just want more? Or?
No, I don't think they're greedy. I think they're frustrated. And the frustration really is, I mentioned Cuomo's forgetting Bill Clinton's admonition about Democrats needing to fall in love. The Working Families Party has fallen on the old liberal shibboleth that powerful executives can just wave a magic wand and bills will pass. That's not the way things work. What you have to do is executives are a part of forging that sense of mutual self-interest that breaks through the deadlock. Now, Cuomo was very successful on that, on the minimum wage, and on same-sex marriage is probably the best example. But here's what happened. The lesson that the Senate Republicans learned from that is they now have a greater fear of primaries coming out of gay marriage passing and what happened to some of their members in that regard. So they're focusing more on primaries than the general elections, whereas the Working Families agenda and the governor's agenda, which, by the way, is shared on campaign finance, shared now on the DREAM Act, is that the Senate Republicans would have to be looking more at November than September primaries, and right now they're looking in a different place. And what undergirds that is the Republican senators figure, okay, we have to avoid a primary. That's our biggest issue. And then we'll get the Conservative Party line as a result of that, and we'll grab the Independence line and running as RCI on 3 lines, we'll somehow skate through in November. And that is what's driving, that's what's creating the logjam from the perspective of the Working Families Party. Now, from the perspective of the Conservative Party, the Republicans are standing up for principle. But we're looking at it in this conversation from the WFP perspective. So their real frustration, their shoulder hurts, but what we're hearing is their wrist is snapping at the governor, but their real problem is they won't solve their problem till they solve this conundrum of how to either change the party control of the Senate or get the Senate majority coalition, which is all but 5 are Republicans, to focus on what drives voters in November.
And this kind of leads a little bit to the fourth point you made, which is that you feel the Working Families Party should be focusing their attention on the Independence Party and reducing their influence on government.
Yeah, quite right. And now, well, I don't know if I'm quite right, but you're
yeah.
quite right in summarizing my point. And therefore, if the Working Families Party had asked me, and they didn't, I would have said, focus your leverage you have on the governor in terms of does he get your line into saying, don't take the independence line if you want our line, because the Independence Party, with all the investigations swirling, all the editorial pressure, they'll have a much tougher time getting 50,000 votes without someone like Andrew Cuomo on the line. And if the Independence Party did not have ballot access, then in these suburban and upstate marginal districts that control that determine who controls the state Senate, then it would just be the conservative line versus the WFP line bolstering the candidates from either the Democrat or Republican Party that they're supporting, rather than the Working Families Party candidates facing candidates who are running on 3 lines. If it was just 2 lines, then the Working Families Party would have far more influence, I would argue, outside of New York City. And that's where they needed to get their legislative agenda accomplished.
And on to that point, we saw that the governor and the entire statewide ticket, Democratic ticket, took the Independence Party backing shortly after the Democratic convention.
Yeah.
And, the Working Families Party's convention's coming up this weekend.
Yep.
Do you think that the governor should have tried to maybe wait on taking the Independence Party backing to better the negotiations with the Working Families Party?
I'm not sure, because 2 things. One, he doesn't determine the timing of that. the timing of those conventions, the Independence Party picked last week for their convention. The Working Families Party picked this Saturday, this coming Saturday for theirs, separated by about a week. And then under the election law, you have a certain period from when that designation is made to accept or decline. So, and the other thing we don't know is, was the Working Families Party playing the card I suggested? I have no idea. Were they saying, if you get our line, don't take the Independence Party line, which is what all three, or actually almost all the editorial boards, not just the ones in New York City, but I believe Newsday and the Times-Union and maybe some upstate editorial boards were in the same spot. I have no way of knowing if they played that card. So I don't think it was Cuomo's mistake, but it was he was victim to the calendar.
And really quickly on your fifth point, the polling numbers, which you think give the progressives a little bit more hope than they probably should have.
Oh yeah, I mean, and again, it's history. I'm old enough to remember when Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. was running for governor on the Liberal Party line against Nelson Rockefeller and Frank O'Connor. Early polls showed him at about the same 24, 25%. He wound up under 10, finishing fourth. The Liberals that year lost column C status, or the third ballot status, to the Conservative Party, never to get it back. In 1980, John Anderson, running for president as an independent, got the Liberal Party line here in New York. Late August, early September polls showed him at about 30% in New York State. He wound up at 7%. There's third-party candidates with few exceptions. And those few exceptions are people like Theodore Roosevelt, who was a past president, or Ross Perot, who was a billionaire, was able to maintain that. Says otherwise, the votes of third parties tend to fall. When the leaves fall in the fall, or when the weather gets a little cold in October, that's when the third-party lines start to fall. So Richard Brodsky argued in a Times-Union column this week, well, if the Working Families Party endorses their own candidate, they might finish ahead of Rob Astorino. That's empirically a tough argument to make, especially when we don't know who that candidate is. We don't know if they can raise money or are self-financing, and the labor unions who have been a big part of the Working Families Party coalition, especially in terms of their vote turnout operation, are rumored, if the press reports are true, and I've learned to trust you guys on things like that, because usually you're right. They're not happy with this and actually leaning towards supporting Cuomo, which is the final factor, which is there's that great example of the old American Labor Party and the Liberal Party. When that fell apart, it only took a couple unions, basically the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the Hatters Union, to remake the Liberal Party, and the Liberal Party supplanted the old American Labor Party. Now, I'm not suggesting that if a new party is formed, which is also being rumored if Cuomo doesn't get the doesn't get the Working Families Party line, if he goes out, but there is that potential. So when I look at this, not from, again, my perspective, but from their self-interest based on what they have articulated their goals are, I think more of a case can be made for them finding a way to come together, them being Cuomo and the Working Families Party, rather than splitting apart.
A scenario where they have more in common than they have difference.
Yes, and given that, now if I'm wrong and the Working Families Party has shifted their mission to that wholesale ideological market and they want to drive moderates out of the Democratic Party, then they should by all means run their own candidate and take it. But if their primary mission remains a policy mission of enacting, in their minds, important legislation to add to the social justice, I think if that mission remains their primary focus, find a way to come together and use that leverage to get the governor on board behind theirs and focusing on the real problem, which is the state senators on the Republican side are focused more on avoiding primaries to their right in September than they are on the marginal general elections, because they believe that's a safer path to take. No one has, until you disprove that, you're not going to change that.
I mean, I think that Roy McDonald and Stephen Saland are both examples of where that came back to bed them.
And I continue to argue, if gay marriage had not passed, that would have infused the Democrats with a great deal of money and enthusiasm. But it's funny, the senators who benefited from that passing on the Republican side, the Long Island Nine, where gay marriage was more popular than unpopular in the general election, none of them voted for it. The profiles in Courage were those Republican senators who had large rural components to their districts, and they paid the price in the primary. Notice Mark Crisanti, who had a suburban district even in western New York, which is perceived as conservative, sailed through that primary in the general election. But Steve Saland faced a bitter primary. He had a more rural exurban district. Yeah. And Roy McDonald in the greater Saratoga, he carried the suburban parts of his district, but got clobbered in the rural portion. So I would argue the Republicans learned the wrong political lesson from that. But, you know, people are entitled to their own views. And I repeat, unless and until the Working Families Party can change either the makeup of the state Senate or the calculation of Republican senators of where their real political interests are, I would argue from the Working Families Party perspective, they want them focused on November rather than September. Nothing will change. And so their frustration leads them to kind of lash out at Governor Cuomo. Yeah. But in reality, to meet their mission, I think they have to address this, what is really behind the logjam in the state Senate. And it's not Governor Cuomo's lack of advocacy. It's a different viewpoint from those Republican senators.
And finally, really quickly,
yep.
I mean, I think Andrew Cuomo knows that he's probably going to be able to win this election without the Working Families Party line. The Working Families Party probably feels that they can get 50,000 votes and keep their ballot line without Andrew Cuomo as their candidate. So is there anyone who really has power in this negotiation going forward? If they both don't need each other but just want each other or possibly want each other?
Right. That's a very good question. I would argue that I think there's relatively equal leverage. There's no one who had, like 4 years ago, Cuomo had the leverage because the Working Families Party was worried, even though they were troubled by some of his moderate stands, they wanted to be a part of what they knew was going to be a landslide. Now this year, Cuomo will win, but he'd love a second landslide. Very few governors have put back-to-back landslides together. You have to go back to Herbert Lehman, maybe Dewey, but certainly Lehman, to have governors who put together 2 consecutive true landslides. So there's a certain amount of legacy bragging rights there. But again, I think the good news is neither has overwhelming leverage, but both have leverage. In other words, there's a mutual self-interest here. The question is, will it meld or will it repel? And at this point, I do not know the answer, and I don't think many people do.
Bruce, thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.